The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the kitchen walls. She stood by the counter, stirring her coffee absently, her mind far from the rhythmic clinking of the spoon against the porcelain cup. The house was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of the newspaper her husband held at the dining table. He sat there, engrossed in headlines and editorials, sipping his coffee without a glance in her direction. This was their routine, a comfortable rhythm they had settled into over the years. Yet it felt hollow. She watched him for a moment. His brow furrowed slightly as he read. The familiar crease she had once found endearing, now a mark of the distance between them. They spoke, of course, exchanging words about groceries, bills, and plans for the weekend. But their conversations had become transactional, devoid of the spark that once lit up their nights. Her thoughts drifted as she sipped her coffee. She couldn't pinpoint when the shift had happened. Was it after the birth of their second child, when sleep-deprived nights replaced spontaneous laughter? Or was it when work began to demand more of his time, leaving her to fill the silences with her own thoughts? She shook her head, dismissing the creeping sadness. Later that afternoon, she found herself at her favorite cafe, a cozy corner she visited when the monotony of the day felt too heavy. The barista greeted her warmly, and she smiled in return, grateful for the small kindness. She settled into her usual seat by the window, her book lying unopened on the table. The world outside moved in its hurried pace, people rushing by with purpose. She envied them. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" The voice startled her, pulling her from her reverie. She looked up to find a man standing there, his warm smile disarming. He held a cup of coffee and gestured to the empty chair across from her. She hesitated, unsure why a stranger's request felt like an intrusion and an invitation all at once. "Oh, no, please go ahead," she replied, her voice polite yet distant. He nodded his thanks and sat down, his presence quietly commanding yet unassuming. She glanced at him briefly, noting the way he carried himself with a calm confidence. He looked to be around her age, his eyes hinting at stories she could only guess. For a while, they sat in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Yet, the air between them felt charged in a way she couldn't quite place. When he finally spoke, it was about the book she hadn't touched. "Good choice. That one kept me up all night when I read it." She blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "You've read it twice," he said with a grin. The way the author explores the characters' inner lives is, well, let's just say it's impressive. Their conversation began cautiously, a mutual testing of waters. He asked her name, and she gave it hesitantly. He offered his in return, a name she would later replay in her mind more times than she cared to admit. He had a way of speaking that made her forget the hours slipping by. His words carried humor, insight, and a subtle curiosity about her that felt unfamiliar yet comforting. By the time she glanced at her watch, it was late. Too late. She excused herself hurriedly, thanking him for the unexpected conversation. As she walked away, she felt the weight of his gaze on her, lingering long after she stepped out into the crisp evening air. When she returned home, her husband was on the couch, flipping through television channels with a disinterested expression. He looked up briefly, smiled, and asked if she had a good time at the cafe. She nodded, her response automatic, her mind still replaying snippets of a conversation that felt like a lifeline in the sea of her otherwise predictable life. That night, as she lay in bed, her husband's soft breathing beside her, she stared at the ceiling. She told herself it was just a chance encounter, nothing more. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. A door she hadn't known existed had opened, and she wasn't sure she wanted to close it. The next morning arrived with its usual quiet bustle. She moved through her routine, making breakfast, packing lunches, and tidying up, but her mind was elsewhere. The stranger's words lingered in her thoughts, as if etched into the air around her. She caught herself smiling at the memory of his laugh, then quickly dismissed it, feeling the sharp sting of guilt. Her husband left for work with a quick peck on her cheek and a distracted "have a good day." She stood at the door, watching his car pull out of the driveway, the engine's hum fading into the distance. The house felt emptier than usual. Unable to focus, she found herself drawn back to the cafe that afternoon. She told herself it was for the change of scenery, a chance to clear her head. But as she stepped inside, her eyes scanned the room, searching for a familiar face. He wasn't there. Relief and disappointment washed over her in equal measure. She ordered her coffee and settled into the same seat by the window, the one that now felt like hers. The book lay open on the table this time, though she read the same paragraph repeatedly without absorbing a word. Her thoughts were a tangled web of questions she didn't want to answer. Why had she come back? What was she hoping to find? Back again, I see. Her heart skipped a beat at the sound of his voice. She looked up to see him standing there, the same warm smile on his face. He held his coffee, waiting for her permission to sit. She nodded, her words caught in her throat. "You must really love this place," he said as he sat down. His tone was light, teasing, yet it felt like he could see through her. "It's peaceful here," she managed to reply, her voice quieter than she intended. Their conversation picked up where it had left off, flowing effortlessly as if no time had passed. He asked her about her day, her interests, her dreams. She found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years, sharing pieces of herself she had almost forgotten. His attention was undivided, his curiosity genuine. It was intoxicating. When she finally left the cafe, the sun was low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the streets. She felt lighter and heavier all at once, the conflicting emotions a knot in her chest. As she walked home, her thoughts raced. She replayed their conversation. Every word, every smile, every moment of connection. That evening, she sat at the dinner table with her husband and children, the sound of laughter and clinking plates filling the room. Yet, she felt like an outsider, watching her life from a distance. The stranger's voice echoed in her mind, a melody she couldn't ignore. In bed that night, as her husband reached for her hand, she hesitated. The guilt was suffocating, yet it couldn't drown out the spark of something she hadn't felt in years. She lay awake long after he had fallen asleep, her heart and mind at war, the memory of the stranger's smile a beacon and a burden. The days that followed were a blur of routine, yet every moment seemed tinged with a restless energy she couldn't shake. She moved through her life on autopilot, attending to her family and household with practiced ease, but her thoughts betrayed her. They wandered back to the cafe, to the conversations that felt more vivid and real than anything else in her carefully constructed world. Her visits to the cafe became more frequent. At first, she told herself it was simply for the comfort of the familiar space. Yet, each time she stepped through the doors, her heart quickened in anticipation. She would scan the room, her pulse racing, until her eyes met his. Their exchanges became the highlight of her days, a secret she kept tucked away like a forbidden treasure. He had a way of making her feel seen. He listened intently, his eyes never wavering, as if her words held a weight she had long forgotten. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations weaving an intimacy that both thrilled and frightened her. She shared pieces of herself she hadn't even realized were missing, and in return, he offered glimpses of a life that seemed both foreign and tantalizing. One afternoon, as they lingered over their coffees, he asked a question that caught her off guard. "Are you happy?" The simplicity of the question left her speechless. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she looked away, her silence speaking volumes. He didn't press her, his understanding smile both a comfort and a challenge. That evening, as she prepared dinner, her husband entered the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her from behind. It was a rare gesture of affection, one that should have warmed her. Instead, she stiffened, the guilt of her secret threatening to consume her. He didn't seem to notice, planting a kiss on her cheek before retreating to the living room. She stared at the simmering pot on the stove, her reflection in the window a stranger's face. Later, as she lay in bed, the question echoed in her mind. "Are you happy?" She realized she didn't know the answer. The life she had built, the life she had once cherished, now felt like a cage. And yet, the thought of stepping beyond its confines terrified her. The stranger had awakened something within her, a hunger for more. But at what cost? She closed her eyes, willing sleep to come, but it eluded her. Instead, she lay there in the darkness, caught between the pull of the unfamiliar and the weight of the familiar, her heart a battlefield of conflicting desires. The weeks stretched on, and the weight of her double life began to crush her. The once exhilarating conversations with the stranger now left her feeling hollow, each exchange a reminder of the emotional betrayal she had committed. At home, her husband's presence became unbearable. His trust and kindness were daggers to her guilt-ridden heart. One rainy evening, she found herself back at the cafe. The stranger was there, waiting as if he had known she would come. They sat in silence at first, the noise of the rain on the windows filling the space between them. "I can't do this anymore," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I'm not this person." He looked at her, his gaze steady but tinged with sadness. "You're not happy," he said softly, "and you deserve to be." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what I deserve anymore." The conversation that followed was quiet, raw, and final. When she left the cafe that night, she knew it would be the last time she saw him. The rain soaked through her coat as she walked home, but she welcomed the chill. It felt like penance. When she entered the house, her husband was waiting, concern etched on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. They sat together at the kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken words. She told him everything, her voice breaking as she confessed the emotional affair that had consumed her. He listened, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. When she finished, silence stretched between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I've known," he said, his words slicing through the air. "I've known for weeks." Her breath caught, the weight of his revelation rendering her speechless. He leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "Do you know why I didn't confront you? Because I wanted to see if you'd come back to me on your own. If you'd remember who we are. But now, I'm not sure you even know." Her heart pounded, the floor beneath her threatening to give way. You knew." "I followed you," he admitted, his voice unwavering. "I saw you with him. I saw the way you looked at him, and I hated you for it. But I hated myself more for still loving you." Tears streamed down her face, her hands trembling as she reached for his. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I don't deserve you." He pulled his hands back, shaking his head. "Maybe you don't. Or maybe I don't deserve the woman you used to be. But either way, we can't keep pretending." The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, he stood, his voice calm, yet final. "I'm leaving for a while. Don't call me. Don't follow me. If we have any chance at fixing this, it has to start with you figuring out who you really are." As the door closed behind him, the house fell into a deafening quiet. She sat alone at the table, her world crumbling around her. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't just losing him. She had lost herself. The only sound in the house was the ticking of the clock, each second echoing like a judgment. And as the weight of her choices bore down on her, she whispered into the emptiness, "Who am I now?